Welcome to our In Focus discussion tonight on the one-year anniversary of George Floyd's death. As we just saw, Floyd's murder brought out millions of people to demand racial justice and police reform. Many Utahns participated in protests in his name. Most were peaceful, but some became violent and destructive. And during the past legislative session, we saw several bills passed into law aimed to improve policing in our state. So tonight, we reflect on the past year, talk about the progress made and the work that still needs to be done. Joining us first is Lex Scott, organizer of Black Lives Matter Utah. And Lex, we always appreciate you so much for making time for us. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me, Rosie.
Now, Lex, your activism work began about 6-7 years before George Floyd's death, and your organization and allies continuously pushed for police reform and racial justice over this time. Take us back to the day when you heard about what happened to Floyd in Minneapolis and saw the video of his death for the first time.
Well, we receive a lot of police brutality victims videos, and I was tagged in that video several times, and I thought another black person was killed by police. We receive these videos all the time. 353 people have been killed by police so far this year. So it's always emotional, it's always painful to see someone killed by police.
And it never gets easier. Now,
No.
Passionate demonstrations broke out across the country in the days following Floyd's death, including right here in Salt Lake City. It was one of the destructive days in our city. What do you remember about that moment in time?
So those protests were not Black Lives Matter Utah. I was protesting in Minneapolis at the time and received calls from Utah saying that protests here had gotten interesting. And that's what I remember. Then I remember people thinking that it was Black Lives Matter Utah. It was not. We have never incited violence or destroyed property in 8 years.
And I remember that because we covered it when Black Lives Matter Utah had to come out and clarify that the violence and the destruction was not from people who were part of your organization, and even just some concerns about people who were causing the destruction and yelling Black Lives Matter Utah to sort of sabotage your movement. Now, when the country was prepared to hear the verdict in Derek Chauvin's murder trial, the former Minneapolis police officer who was kneeling on Floyd's neck when he died, many people felt nervous and anxious about the verdict. And can you talk about why that may have been?
I think that people create worst case scenarios in their mind about how things should happen or might happen. We held a celebration that night for the guilty verdict. We feel like there is not complete justice. There are still other officers who need to be charged and convicted and found guilty. But, you know, if people are on edge, then they really truly don't understand the movement. The majority of the Black Lives Matter protests in this country have been peaceful, and especially in Utah.
There's been a bigger push for legislation around police reform around the country and in Utah following Floyd's death. Was the push and the outcome so far what you were expecting?
See, we want the total package. We want the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act that is sitting in the Senate in Washington, D.C. That is the total package that we want. Mayor Mendenhall passed the lethal force policy. She also created a racial justice and policing commission. We have had some bills passed on the Hill. They are not all the bills that we wanted. That's why we may have to launch ballot initiatives, and we have been holding meetings about our ballot initiatives. And so, yeah, it's not everything that we wanted. We just want a system where George Floyd can't happen again, and we don't believe that we have that system in place yet.
Yeah, it just shows how much more work needs to be done. How did you and your organization reflect, remember, or memorialize George Floyd on the one-year anniversary of his death yesterday?
Our members and the members of SLRM, Salt Lake Equal Rights Movement, met at the mural of George Floyd yesterday to hold a vigil. But we realized that the work is not far from over. We have to keep moving. If you look at the wall of murals in downtown Salt Lake City of police brutality victims, George Floyd is the only victim that ever received a guilty verdict. for an officer-involved shooting. So we definitely have a lot of work to go.
Yeah, and this mural started with George Floyd's face, and now there's probably more than a dozen people on that mural. Lex, have you noticed more support to the Black Lives Matter Utah movement after George Floyd's death?
So we've had about 6,000 new members join the chapter. It's not about membership, it's all about quality over quantity for us, and it's about checks and balances and actual police reform. So welcome to all of the new members. Start calling your senators. But you know, having 6,000 new members and no police reform really doesn't make me happy. I'm sorry to be so negative today, Rosie.
This is a serious and a very deep conversation, so don't feel bad. But you're right, it's all about the quality, not the quality, right? And there's this concept of performative activism. Like, yeah, you can come out and protest, post stuff on your social media, but we need the work, right, where it counts. We have about a minute left. Final question for you. What changes and progress have you observed in the past year? You talked a little bit about this. And what would you say we still need to work on?
So it's very exciting to turn on the television and hear the words Justice and Policing Act on a national stage. It is so exciting that the majority of police departments are at least hearing about police reform, and that we had, I think it was between 20 and 60 police reform bills on the Hill. But this issue isn't over. Just because the crowds have gone home, we need legislators to still focus on police reform.
Well said. You've been hearing from Lex Scott, organizer of Black Lives Matter Utah. Lex, thank you always for your time. We appreciate your participation in our discussions.
Thank you.
We'll be right back. Thanks for staying with us for our second In Focus discussion tonight on the one-year anniversary of George Floyd's death. Up next in our discussion is Dr. LaShawn Williams, Assistant Professor of Social Work at Utah Valley University. Dr. Williams, it's good to see you again. Thank you for coming back on our show.
Thanks, Rosie. Good to see you too.
Dr. Williams, we'll begin with the issue of police brutality and racial justice. It was not something new at the time of George Floyd's death, and we saw several high-profile cases before that, such as Mike Brown, Freddie Gray, and Philando Castile. Why do you think Floyd's death created such an enormous response like what we saw last year?
It was the length of time. Most police brutality incidents escalate and happen within 2 minutes. This one lasted nearly 10. And because of the pandemic, we couldn't look away. We couldn't distract ourselves with anything else. We were forced to reckon with what happened to this man, this murder.
Now, the response that we saw was wider than other protests in the past. More people got involved as first-time activists. Why do you think that is? And did the pandemic, like you mentioned earlier, have anything to do with it?
I think a lot of people realize that such a long amount of time, and people said, I felt like I wanted to jump in and to push the officer off of George. I wanted to do something. It really called, I think, to a collective humanity in all of us and a survival response when we saw someone that was not going to survive that situation. I think the pandemic and the notion of preventable loss also impacted a lot of people because there was so much that was unpreventable and out of our control. His murder was within our control if someone had done something in that moment. Because they didn't, because he didn't, we then realized that we needed to do something as a collective and as a people.
Now, there were marches internationally. We saw movements across the world. What would you say that they were responding to? Was it systemic racism, oppression, police brutality, all of the above, or other things?
It was all of the above. When people were standing up together for Black lives in the US, it's also rooted in the experiences of Black people in their own countries. The protests in London were about the 1993 murder of Stephen Lawrence, and it's this addition of so many names to this list of Black lives. And I think it's complicated by the presence and the reputation of the US throughout the world. If this is what's happening in the US, what can happen to the rest of us. And we should stand in solidarity with United States citizens for Black lives.
It was really incredible what we saw, like, across the world. Dr. Williams, let's talk about what was happening in Minneapolis just a few months ago. Derek Chauvin was on trial for Floyd's murder, and right around that time, there was another controversial fatal police shooting where an officer claimed she accidentally grabbed her gun instead of her taser. What were you thinking about during that moment? And can you talk about the different elements that were happening in Minneapolis at that time?
I think one of the most difficult things was to see that we were interrupting the murder trial of Derek Chauvin to talk about the killing of another Black person in the same city, in the same state. Because the idea is that when you have someone on trial, it sends a message that regulates the behavior of other officers. And immediately we saw that it was not having that effect, because you had another police brutality killing that happened while the trial was ongoing. And not just that one, even on the verdict, the day of the verdict, another police involved shooting happened with another Black person.
Fast forward to Tuesday, which was yesterday. What were you thinking about on the 1-year anniversary of George Floyd's death?
Very similar to Lex. We still have a long way to go. We are putting our hope and our faith in systems and legislation that we believe will impact hearts and minds by regulating behaviors. It's going to take all of us to help each of us in this moment. And 1 year later, I think we recognize what we're truly up against, which is a larger system that's going to take a lot of work. As much work as it took to get into this system, it may take us that long to get out of this system or to redesign it or reconstruct it together.
Right. Very true. And we can't lose that momentum, because this fight is going to take a lot of work, but it will be worth it. What do you think will happen next in the nationwide conversations and debates with police reform and racial justice?
I don't know that I can predict too much. What I hope will happen is that we will see our officers begin to hold one another accountable and to be able to be protected when they're doing that. There was the case of a female officer in New York who lost her pension the year before she was to receive it because she held a fellow officer accountable. Within weeks of the Derek Chauvin verdict, she was able to get reinstated and receive her pension. We need more protection for officers who want their profession to shine as community members and law enforcement, so that they can be the people and the protectors that they swore an oath to be. I hope our conversations continue to move us in that direction. We can discuss redistributing funds, we can discuss reconstructing police departments, and we can discuss conversations and connections between communities and the officers that serve those communities.
Yeah, it just shows we're just brushing the tip of this discussion tonight. You've been hearing from Dr. LaShawn Williams, Assistant Professor of Social Work at Utah Valley University. Dr. Williams, thank you for making time for us on a Wednesday evening. It was good to hear from you.
Thank you so much, Rosie.
We'll be right back. Welcome to our third and final In Focus discussion tonight on the 1-year anniversary of the death of George Floyd. Rounding out our conversation tonight is Chris Burbank, Vice President for the Center for Policing Equity and former Chief of the Salt Lake City Police Department. Chris, welcome back to the show. We appreciate you for being here.
Always my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Chris, take us back to the day that you found out about George Floyd's death and saw the video of what happened. What were your initial thoughts and feelings?
Outrage. That served no necessary police action, and disappointment that, if you think I've been dealing with this now for 30 years in my career, starting with Rodney King in Los Angeles. And yes, there's been a moment in time that's raised everyone's awareness, but this is nothing new. Why are we just coming to this conclusion and need to change?
I think a lot of people share the same sentiment as you, that why did it have to take a situation like George Floyd, something so devastating, for us to finally have these conversations at the legislative level, and at the community level. Now, a topic that's come up in discussion when it comes to policing is moving violations and how there have been instances when they've been used as a way to pull someone over to look into something bigger. Should there be reform to change this?
Absolutely, but not for that particular reason. That is a significant reason. But more importantly, when you look at the act of writing a ticket, there is no scientific correlation between improved safety on a roadway and the act of writing a ticket. If you think of the millions of dollars in expense on 7th East alone that's been spent with officers who have to hide and allow you to commit this heinous violation in order to write you a ticket, park a police car on the side of the road, and what happens? Everyone slows down, and it doesn't matter what color your skin is. It is nonsense that we continue down the road of the same thing, let's just do it kindler and gentler.
That's very interesting. Now, according to the group Mapping Police Violence, there have been 966 more people who were killed by police in the past year. And out of that number, 181 of those people were black. So what kind of work do we still need to do when it comes to police reform?
Well, I will tell you, what we need to do is move beyond these numbers that represent huge, vast numbers of people. One single person losing their life unnecessarily is too many. Even when we view these things and we say, oh, that was a bad person, they committed whatever crime, it is a failure of our society when someone loses their life, whether a citizen or a police officer. We have to be able to police ourselves peacefully if we're ever going to move beyond this.
Chris, I want to take us back to May 30th, 2020 last year. It was such a destructive day in downtown Salt Lake City. You've lived in this area for quite some time. Do you ever remember a time when we saw such destruction in the area and such a response from the community like that?
No, absolutely not. And interestingly enough, we have had marches in Salt Lake City that were actually larger, much larger than this when you talk about immigration and some of the things that have gone on in the past. And you had conflict between groups. And why this one flared out of hand, it was unbelievable to watch.
Now, President Biden wanted to get a bill passed in George Floyd's name yesterday, but it was held up in Congress because of the debate over qualified immunity. What are your thoughts about it, and how do you think this topic should be addressed?
So qualified immunity I view as a little bit of the red herring out there on this bill. Right? If you think about all that can be accomplished in this bill, it's significant. And to lose this bill over that 1/10%. The thing is, qualified immunity does play a role, but punishment, right? When we think about you have to punish somebody, and have we been successful punishing or threatening to punish people over the years, whether they are criminals or police? We have not. And so why are we going to hang everything else on this bill on that one thing? I say we move it forward without it.
Very interesting viewpoint. Chris, what did the 1-year anniversary of George Floyd's death mean to you? What was going through your mind yesterday?
Well, we actually had an organizational call with the Center for Policing Equity. And there's many, many young people, I'm the old person in the group, that work for us across the country, across the nation, who have hope and expectation that there's going to be change come from this. And to think that it has actually been an entire year and we have not made that, we're still talking about blue ribbon commissions. Now is the time for action, not talk. We know what needs to be done. We need to stop doing the same things over again, hoping for a different outcome. Change what police do, not simply how they do it.
All right, you've been hearing from Chris Burbank, Vice President at the Center for Policing Equity. Chris, thank you so much for your participation in our discussion. We appreciate your input.
Thanks for having me.